Oh, good afternoon. I think it's time to start. Wonderful day from Vienna to, I think, Croatia, to Serbia, to Kosovo, and to all of you, wherever you are sitting right now. My name is Vedran Džihić. I'm senior researcher at the Austrian Institute of International Affairs. This is a panel debate entitled From Ukraine to the Western Balkans, Moscow and Beijing pushing systemic competition into a new and dangerous phase. And you see there are some interesting questions in the title already. I will be moderating the session. Before we start, I just want to say that this public discussion today, Zoom discussion today, is organized by the Austrian Institute for International Affairs in cooperation with the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, and it is also supported by the Austrian American Fund run by the US Embassy. Before we jump into the topic, I want to introduce Wolfgang Petritsch. Wolfgang Petritsch, who has held different diplomatic positions over the last decades, including the chief negotiator for the European Union in Kosovo at Rambouillet, and then later being the High Commissioner for at the Office of High Commissioner, High Representative in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He recently became president of our Institute for International Affairs in Vienna. And I would like to invite Wolfgang here, sitting with two hats. One hat is president of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. The second hat is the president of the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. I would like to invite you, Wolfgang, to say a few words at the beginning, and then I will take over, introduce our panel today, and jump into the topic. So, Wolfgang, Zoom is yours.
Vedrane, hvala puno. Thank you so much, and let me maybe set a stage by introducing a few of my rather controversial thoughts, because I think it's important to get the discussion started now at a point where we have a very dramatic, in the minds of most of the people, the most dramatic situation since 1989. My first point actually is to say that it is not the turning point today. The turning point already happened 2014. I think we need to keep in mind when the Crimea was occupied, when the war started in the eastern part of Ukraine, our reaction in the so-called West, which now obviously is being reconstituted by this war, was rather haphazard. I remember writing a peer-reviewed study for the Austrian National Bank in 2018. Unfortunately, it's not included in the latest working paper, Vedran. I made this point, and I said that this is actually what we need to watch. The consequences of this issue was at a time, for me at least, much more important than anything else that has happened afterwards, which is a consequence. And war now in Ukraine, in many ways, is a consequence of our not handling of the situation. Remember the visit of President Putin briefly thereafter in Austria. He received a hero's welcome, I should say, and was really cajoled and admired by so many Austrians. That was definitely a low point in Austria's foreign policy and relations with Russia. But this should just be mentioned here. How we did not realize what the Crimea really meant and the consequences that have evolved since then. Now, it is, however, a wake-up call, obviously, And in there, I see, and this is my second point, the danger of an overreaction, of a militarization of our Russia policy, a militarization of the European Union as such, because we need to keep in mind that in spite of being part of the most important and the most powerful, economically most powerful bloc, the European Union, in the case of Austria. And in spite of having, so to speak, the support of NATO, the largest and most impressive and most powerful and most expensive military alliance in world history, what is the reaction on the part of this over-militarized Western side? It's actually, we have to, from Washington to Brussels, we have to reiterate time and again that actually we are not going to use our weaponry. So that actually needs to be part of our deliberations when it comes to the European Union's idea, proposal, and of course also legitimate proposal to add to the peace project that is the European Union sort of a defense dimension. That is something which I truly believe that this is necessary, particularly when it comes to the region that we are actually talking about. But as I said before, I would like to set the stage and give a broader picture. What are we confronted with? And we also need to be aware that if we call the current conflict, the current war, as actually World War III in the making, we are actually diverting all our necessary attention from the Western Balkans. Because if this is really a World War III, then why care about such a small and relatively unimportant, also geopolitically, geostrategically not very important part in the middle of the European Union. Now, let me make a third point. The latest elections, and there again, I would like to be a bit, so to speak, hetero-orthodox. Yeah? The latest election results, actually, I am not so much concerned about Serbia's results. I mean, there, the autocrat President Vučić, that was expected that he is going to be elected. It is actually positive that the opposition parties have participated there, but the problems are not going to be resolved. The media, the autocratic system, the state capture by Vučić and so on. This is something we have had before, and we're going to deal with it. What is more concerning for me is the election results in Hungary. Because here, together, particularly, I'm not saying together now, I have to, because you will know why I'm not saying together. Here, Hungary is actually the enemy within. And this is much more dangerous for the systemic consequences that we will have to deal with from the outcome of the Ukraine war. But in the case of the Western Balkans, you have yet another, I wouldn't say enemy, but unfriendly friend within the European Union, and that is Croatia. I mean, Croatia's foreign policy, it seems to me, has one and only one priority, and this is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it is clearly not being considered foreign policy. It is being considered a domestic policy and politics. And this is being handled via Brussels. When you talk to those member states in the European Union who are farther away from the Western Balkans, they all are wondering what's actually happening. What are those nice and small? What is Croatia all about? Why are they so fixated on this? Okay, if they want it, they can get it, so to speak. I'm not going to engage. There's so many other, much more important issues that we in the European Union have to deal with. And you will see now with the election reform, if it ever happens, there's going to be a very strong imprint on the part of Croatia. And I must say, since I was involved in breaking up, in opening up the election reform 20 years ago and making possible that Mr. Komšić is now in power, has been for many, for 2 or 3 times before that, but also Mr. Čović was elected with precisely the same election reform that we did 20 years ago. So now he's complaining not about the election reform, in fact, or what he's complaining about is really that he was not elected. Anyhow, this is already too much of a detail, but sometimes it's necessary to have a look into the details. Now, my last point is the following. I think we have to now really get serious about the approach in terms of accession. How are we going to handle the accession negotiations? We need to put this on a fully, in my opinion, a fully new platform. We need to really think out of the box, and we need to stop this kind of ticking off. Also, the French inspired reform did not do the trick, as we know. I think what is needed now is a staged accession process, which means a partial and progressive membership approach that needs to be taken. We need an immediate access to the structural investment funds, to give you just a few examples, and also to other EU institutions. We also need the accession candidates to become part of the justice scoreboard, for example, and we need to also include the 6 from there into our rule of law reports. This is just a few examples where I believe accession has to be far more specific and concrete and staged and done in a progressive way. This is the way to handle China. This is the way to handle Russia. And by the way, I think the last Serb and sympathizer, Putin sympathizer, will understand that Russia is out of business for the Western Balkans. Of course, it will continue to do business there in terms of spoiler strategy. But who will want to have a partner who is totally isolated, who has just lost, is about to lose a war, at least in Western eyes, who has an economy which is barely 3.5 times of that of tiny little Austria, which has not yet reached the economic standards of 1922 as Russia. We need to keep this in mind, and that means that only then we'll be able to handle and to apply our forces, which are less so military and much more so democratic, economic, and culturally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang, for setting the stage. I mean, you put so much on our table. I'm not quite sure that we can digest it and that the food is really delicious, because the arguments that you put forward are quite controversial and critical and hard to digest, obviously. I mean, you mentioned just in your last point that Russia is out of the business, as we will see. I'm not quite sure. I do think that Russia still has a momentum to spoil and to try to spoil the Western business in the Balkans, but this is something that our experts are going to discuss from the country's perspectives. I would suggest that we move to our 4 panel participants, and just going to briefly introduce them, not to lose too much time. I think there are so many topics on the table we want to discuss them. So first of all, I welcome Senada Šelo-Šabić. She is with the Institute for Development and International Relations in Zagreb. Wolfgang, you mentioned Zagreb and Croatia, so we are quite keen to hear what Senada has to say on the Croatian position to Bosnia, but also on the Chinese influence in Croatia, which is quite high and might even rise and increase. Then we have Donika Emini joining us, if I'm not mistaken, right now from Pristina, Kosovo. She is working with the Civicos platform. She's also a member of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group and my colleague there. Welcome, Donika. I just listened to your Prime Minister yesterday at CNN with some interesting points. We'll probably touch upon it later on. Then we traveled to Belgrade. Electoral results in Belgrade were mentioned by Wolfgang. There was a lot of attention in the Austrian media on the victory of two autocrats, brothers in arms, if you wish so, Fidesz, SNS, Orban and Vucic. We are keen to hear what you have to say on this new systemic competition and the role of Russia and China. And last but not least, and this is going to be another input to broaden our horizon, I welcome my colleague from the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, Thomas Eder. Thomas Eder is specializing in Chinese studies. He has intensively been observing the Chinese discourse on the war in Ukraine recently, but also looking basically on what China has to say and wants to do in the Western Balkans too. So if you agree, I would like to give Zoom and floor, or the table full of food, provided by Wolfgang, to you, Thomas, for a first insight to give us a kind of an impression. What is China's position right now? What is coming from China in terms of the narrative of the discourse? And then we take it to the region and to the countries. So, Thomas, the floor is yours.
All right, Vedran, thank you very much. Indeed, a lot on the table. I'm gonna start with taking us to the Western Balkans and then a few words on Ukraine. What I want to share with you is some insights from debates among Chinese academic scholars and think tankers, the policy discourse. And on the Western Balkans, I want to first make 3 points here. Firstly, what Chinese authors emphasize about China's presence in the Western Balkans is that there's supposedly a focus on economic interests. They talk a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative, and where they do, they list acquiring contracts for Chinese state-owned enterprises as a first goal. These companies need to be kept busy and China's economy kept humming. Sector-wise, this goes for transport and energy infrastructure, but also mining, heavy industry, and telecommunications. A second goal here is to have these companies acquaint themselves with EU rules and standards, which is supposedly possible here as harmonization processes are already ongoing in candidate countries. Companies are also supposed to build a reputation in Europe through successful projects here and gain recognition for Chinese technical standards. In short, they are to use the Western Balkans as a launching pad into the EU market. Finally, on this point, Chinese debates also paint the much discussed 16+1 diplomatic platform between Central Eastern European countries and China as basically a scheme to further Chinese business interests. Now, the second point, Chinese authors do still comment critically on local politics. They criticize supposedly low levels of rule of law as well as corruption in the Western Balkans without commenting on China's own problems. Interestingly, they also note that frequent changes of government are a considerable risk and that politically stable countries can expect more Chinese projects. So we can think of stability a la Vucic in Serbia here. Authors air concerns that some states in the region do not identify with China's development model and that there are quote unquote unfriendly voices in the public discourse. So accordingly, stronger Chinese influence and alignment by regional countries would be quite welcome. The third point from the Chinese discourse here in the Western Balkans is that China's activities actually contribute to these countries' accession to the EU. Authors say that an important context here is that China's government repeatedly also expressed its support for EU accession of these countries. The goal is to gain influence within the EU via Western Balkan states that Beijing has built deep ties with. According to these scholars, EU concerns about competing Chinese influence and systemic competition are just due to a lack of trust that can be remedied in due course. China is described as just another investor conforming with local rules that are being harmonized with the EU anyway. And China's projects are claimed to strengthen local economies and thereby rendering an eventual EU accession more likely. These infrastructure projects are said to connect quite nicely with the EU's trans-European networks. Now, very briefly on China and the Russia-Ukraine war. Here, I would like to say, and Vedran and I have argued, that China is actually facilitating a new and dangerous phase of systemic competition. And I want to elaborate briefly. China is walking a fine line here. It has abstained in the United Nations from votes on Ukraine in the Security Council and the General Assembly, but diplomatically, generally, it stays very close to Russia. It defends Russia's positions consistently and also strays from its previous principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference. It has also, at the International Court of Justice, which has on 16 March ordered Russia to end hostilities. China has voted against this ruling together with Russia as the only country joining it there. And basically it has strengthened Russia's back. And this is where we come to this new phase where we see authoritarian countries, in this case Russia, trying to install a friendly regime in Ukraine by force, and China supporting it. And this is the question we want to pose as to whether in the future this could also portend quite ominously for the Western Balkans, and specifically for Bosnia-Herzegovina. So thank you. This is all from me for now.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I hope Vuk is still with us because I want now to have us traveling to Belgrade. Vuk, I mean, given the results of the elections on Sunday and yet another victory of Vučić, there are many questions that we could pose. First of all, how is Serbia going to play the game with Russia? Or what is going to happen in the next few weeks and months? How much is this opening towards China going to be pushed by Vučić? And thirdly, definitely the question, how is the West going to now address the new regime, the new old regime in Belgrade? What we saw yesterday, I mean, this is, if you could also say a sentence on that one, Putin congratulated Vučić for being re-elected, underlining the importance of close relations between Russia and China, and mentioning that these two brother nations are very close. So this is also particularly interesting. But anyway, the floor is yours. Tell us what's going on in Belgrade and how you see it.
Well, thanks, Vedran. I mean, I want to first start that I think that it is not a big brainer to say that the war in Ukraine was a very, very bad news for Serbia's foreign and security policy. I mean, Serbia once again found itself between the West. I mean, what ties the country to the West? I mean, it's number one, geography, the fact that it is encircled by EU and NATO member states. The second, economy, by virtue of the fact that despite everything, the West remains country's primary economic partner, or to be more precise, the EU on almost every objective metric. And number three is that the Serbia's illiberal political regime still needs a political green light from the West in order to remain in power. On the other hand, there was Russia, for which Serbia is tied by three factors: Kosovo dispute, gas dependency, and the popularity of Russia in Serbian public opinion. Last time, when the Crimea happened back in 2014, it was very easy. Serbia first flew below the radar to avoid being hit by any stray bullet at the beginning of the crisis, and then in return to the old game to play Russia and the West against each other, as symbolized by Putin's attendance at the 2014 military parade in Belgrade. Now, Serbian leadership is possibly by instinct tempted to repeat this same two-step routine. However, now it cannot do so because everybody is aware that the stakes are much higher and that this crisis is more dangerous. Now, there is also a factor of the EU. In the past, whenever EU would try to pressure Serbia, it didn't have the adequate leverage because for the simple reason the EU would say, well, this is not the behavior of an EU membership candidate, we'll not let you in. And Serbian leadership would simply call Brussels bluff, saying, well, you're not accepting us in anyway, and it has nothing to do with our Russia policy. However, given the severity of the crisis, there are some other potential leverages that EU has at its disposal. If going gets tough, the EU can say, oh, you don't like our sanctions? Well, you don't like EU funds either. You don't like visa-free regime, or you don't like investments from the European countries. Now, my expectation, and I'm still not quite sure whether I was right or wrong, we will have to wait and see, is that I was expecting that Vučić would win the elections, buy time, and try to win over some concessions in order to at least, after the elections, join at least some of the sanctions which the EU applied against him. And of course, during the electoral campaign, we did see some measures from Serbia. Votes in the UN, votes in the OSCE, votes in UNESCO in favor of Ukraine. We also saw the fact that Serbia did join EU sanctions against former Ukrainian President Yanukovych, who is supposed to be a dual citizen of Russia. So we still don't know whether these were baby steps or simply cosmetics, throwing a couple of bones to the European Union. And at the same time, I think that what Vučić was afraid most during this period was the popularity of Russia in his among his domestic public. Of course, he shares part of that responsibility, given that his tabloid machinery had made Putin into a rock star these past 8 years. However, you all saw the gathering in Belgrade, the pro-Russian gathering at one point, which was probably the only one in Europe and probably even wider. I mean, we don't know who organized it, but we can do some scenario mappings. Option number one, that it was organized by the government so that it can say to the European Union, see, this is why my hands are tied. This is why I cannot join the sanctions. Option number two, and it is not excluded from option number one, is that he was saying to the Russians, we vote in the UN in favor of Ukraine, but we still love you guys. Or it can very be the most dangerous option, option number three, that it was organized by the pro-Russian players so they can send a message to Vučić, don't even dare joining EU sanctions against Russia. So all three options are highly risky. Of course, we also have a problem of gas, and now Serbia has to renegotiate new price of gas with the Russians. So again, a very tough spot for Vučić. However, the electoral results are a big problem because, as probably all of you saw, the ruling majority cannot be formed without Socialist Party of Serbia led by the parliament chair Ivica Dačić. And that is a major difference because unlike the pragmatic Vučić, who likes to balance and play Russia and the West against each other, Dačić is openly pro-Russian player. We can say that in the past couple of years, the only thing which kept Ivica Dačić as part of the ruling coalition was the fact that he was close to Moscow, and Vučić needed someone who would represent Moscow's interest as part of his ruling coalition. So he's in a tough spot between potential Western pressures externally and, of course, the fact that he needs a pro-Russian player to form a majority coalition domestically. So we will have to wait and see, although I expect that Vučić will buy time and that he will take a full constitutional time, which is 3 months from the days that the official results are counted in. And he will wait until the government is formed, buy time, hoping that something else will happen, that he will make some new deal with the West, or that some crisis elsewhere might emerge, which will divert Western attention away from Ukraine and Serbia's stance towards Ukraine. Either case, I also think that some cooperation with Russia will be scaled back by Belgrade, like, for example, military cooperation to avoid open hostility from the West. However, this brings us to another player, which is China. I think that in this period, China has become, to borrow a Pakistani saying on its ties with China, for Serbian leadership, China has become an all-weather friend. Even before this war, for the past 2 years, Serbia has replaced Russia with China as its primary partner in the East. During the elections, Chinese economic projects played a role in promoting Serbian leadership. Now, with all eyes on Russia, Serbia deems China even more important and feels to a certain degree that it has leeway to pursue ties with China. Now, what will be the consequence of this war in the Balkans? I don't expect that there will be a war, but I do expect that there can be an overspill of political dysfunctions, and that this, in some cases, can be manifested violently, not in terms of neither civil war nor interstate war, but perhaps more localized intercommunal violence if it is not handled properly. So Russia might be tempted to disrupt the West by backing, for example, anti-Western groups, disinformation campaigns, intelligence operations, cyber attacks, perhaps even some extreme active measures like blowing up arms depot, which we have seen in both Bulgaria and Czech Republic. So with all eyes on Russia, China will simply continue doing its thing, and it will enjoy the fact that Russia is in the spotlight. I would say that any distancing of Serbia from Russia in any intensity, in any shape or form, will be a godsend to China because it will skillfully use the vacuum. China is skillful to use any vacuums that the Europeans leave behind. I believe that it will do the same in terms of any vacuum left by the Russians. Of course, I mean, the congratulatory note that you mentioned from Putin, yes, it does show that Putin is aware of one of the rare countries in Europe which hasn't introduced sanctions against him, but it can also be a warning for Vučić as well. So, I mean, on the last point, I would say is that any pressure that Serbia is experiencing right now regarding Russia is just a teaser for the real thing, which will happen one way or the other in the long term, which is the pressure it will experience once Sino-American rivalry reaches the Balkans and Serbia's shore. So thank you, and I hope that I haven't breached too much of my time.
Vuk, thanks a lot. Many important points, but I just have one quick follow-up question. I mean, Serbia is set to sign the free trade agreement with China towards the end of the year. This is at least what the president's announced in February. So can you just comment on how much this is going to push the corrosive capital of China floating into Serbia, and what is this going to cause for or have an impact on the Serbian EU or Western relations?
Yes, well, I mean, the idea of this free trade agreement was floated during the Winter Olympics in Beijing, when President Vučić was one of the rare foreign dignitaries who met with his Chinese counterpart, President Xi. And of course, the main concern was the fact that given the quantitative and qualitative disparities between the two economies, Serbia would open its doors to a much more powerful Chinese economy, where the Chinese goods and Chinese competitors would actually overflow the Serbian markets and completely destroy Serbian entrepreneurs, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. However, I think that Vučić's main, calculation was the hope that he can attract potentially a foreign investors with this type of maneuvering, saying we have free trade agreements with Russia and it's Eurasian Economic Union, now with China and now with Turkey, so please do come to invest in us. However, I think that all of these was pretty much conditioned by the fact that he would always say, well, we don't have to worry about the EU, we will potentially probably be forced to cancel these free trade agreements once we join the EU, but who knows when will this happen. However, yes, you are absolutely right that this is a major problem of the way China in general operates in the Balkans, because as Thomas said it, yes, the Chinese believe that, yes, they are helping the Balkans to join the EU by building infrastructure, but I think that one point which the Chinese don't understand is the nature of the European Union. This is the point where they're trying, because on one hand, they are trying to connect themselves with the EU and with the European market. But in the end, with their shoddy standards, when it comes to the rule of law, when it comes to labor, environmental, and all the other standards, they are actually pushing not only the Balkans away from the EU, but themselves away from the EU. Because I don't think that they don't understand how the EU defines itself as a regulatory normative power. Because EU sucks at a lot of things, but the one thing in which it is the best in the world are contracts, law, and standards. And I don't think that the Chinese understand that fully.
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot, Vuk. Just a short remark for all of you listening to us and watching us via Zoom. There is a chat function available. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the chat, and I will try to take them into the last Q&A round towards the end of today's discussion. Now, I would like to take us to Pristina, to Kosovo. I think there are several communicating vessels in the Western Balkans. I mean, Serbia and Kosovo obviously are such a communicating vessel. Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, Serbia, etc., etc. Many connecting lines. My question, listening also to Albin Kurti yesterday, and he was quite straightforward. Serbia is on the side of Russia, he said. I am putting more money into my military, increase of 52% of the military budget. This is what he mentioned, and he's clearly pushing into the direction of the NATO membership, asking the countries of the EU that have not recognized Kosovo yet to do it and to introduce the visa liberalization. So, and we know what reactions from the Serbian side are. So do we see here Serbia and Kosovo on the path to some kind of an escalation? What is going to be the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine, and how do you see this kind of a systemic competition playing out in the case of Kosovo?
Thanks a lot, Vedran. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to attend your panels and, of course, share the panel with distinguished experts. A lot has happened we have worked very hard on external influences in the Balkans, and it's not a new topic, but of course it's becoming more emergent now that we are dealing with full-scale Russian aggression in Ukraine. And every time I hear the full scale, I think of one thing, that many in the EU, but also in the US, wouldn't mind if there were, only few regions would be attacked or few regions would be annexed. They wouldn't really mind if that happened, but the full scale aggression is a problem. And this is wrong. This is a salami strategy, the salami approach that Putin has used in the past, and it has worked. And that's why we have the situation in Ukraine with full-scale aggression. I agree with Mr. Petric, but on when the situation escalated, but I wouldn't agree on the timeline, because 2014 is already very late. I think the Russian change of approach globally happened in 2007 with Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference. If you look back and you read the speech, you will understand that he really showcases a different type of Russia in international relations, speaking about, the world is enough of being unipolar now, it should be, the way it was during the Cold War and emergence of new powers, speaking, of course, about Russia. And this is a turning point, because that's when actually Russia opted out of the Vienna negotiations for Kosovo and the Ahtisaari plan, which was planned to go back to the UN Security Council for adoption, but it never went there because Russia did not support it. And of course, then Serbia. So, and then of course it was Georgia, and then with Abkhazia and Ossetia, and then of course Crimea, which many draw parallels, thinking that in 2014 everything changed. And changed for one thing, because instead of intervention from the EU countries or the US, Germany decided to go full scale with Nord Stream 2. So basically it was rewarding and supporting autocrats and behaving around autocrats in such a way that, Mr. Petric mentioned about, the case of Austria, but also in the Western Balkans on how they behaved around leaders who had second options, which were Russia or China. And this, of course, comes to back to Vučić. As for the case of Western Balkans, so the EU engaged in this competition, which wasn't the EU's game to play, in a competition which was led by Russia, potentially to some extent by China, because that's mostly isolated in Serbia. So instead of offering a long-term solution, which is reforms, democratization, and membership, it engaged in short-term sort of games with autocrats, and now we have Vučić winning elections with 70%, and we're talking about a EU integration frontrunner. So this is concerning, and this happened because of the way that EU approached these leaders in the Balkans for so long, specifically being Germany and Merkel. And then, of course, when this happened in Ukraine, in Kosovo, similarly to Bosnia, which you will probably and Senada relate, knowing more from there, the alarms went on, because the first element was, is there any potential escalation going to happen in the northern part of Kosovo? Because it's not the first time. I mean, it's not very rare to see the Russian ambassador with Vučić parading in the Raška military base, which is very close to Kosovo border. And every time something happens in the north, the response comes, militarily alongside to Russia. And then, of course, there is the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, which is ongoing. And the leverage that the EU has, I mean, of course, Vuk can say that the EU has some sort of leverage over Serbia with the funds. I mean, that leverage existed since forever, but the EU rarely used it. So maybe this time the EU would become more firm to use the sanctions when it comes to funds on Serbia, but that there hasn't been any sign of it whatsoever. So the fear in Kosovo, and of Kurti, as a new prime minister, sort of parachuted in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue recently. How do you negotiate with Vučić? How do you negotiate with a person which, to a very, large extent, agrees with what Putin is doing to Ukraine, and also feeds the narrative of Russia, always comparing NATO bombing in Kosovo with what is happening in Ukraine now. And that's why many discussions have been happening in Kosovo, whether, we should really engage in a dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, and what's going to be the future of it, having Vučić with increased leverage in the process. And the last one, of course, is NATO. NATO is very important because when we're talking about competitive external actors in the region, NATO has been differently from the EU, has been very, very successful in expanding towards Western Balkans, knowing that the Adriatic corridor now is already, controlled by NATO, and of course, North Macedonia became part of it recently, and then Kosovo always showed its willingness to be part of it, but then it is, of course, a very problematic issue due to the four non-recognizers in the case of NATO. What Kurti did was that the declaration that it was then took by Reuters and became very famous on Twitter, it was already in the website before the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Kosovo expressed willingness to join NATO, to have a permanent US base and NATO base US base in Kosovo. But then it became more timely and more relevant to be discussed after the intervention in Ukraine. What Albin Kurti is trying to get out of this is, of course, increased cooperation bilaterally with some NATO member states, increase the budget on defense, because seemingly this is becoming very important now that everything in the Balkans is being seen from the security perspective. So and having to deal with Serbia sort of provides this very fertile ground for this type of response, and then of course enhanced communication with NATO. But everything in this regard has to go through the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, which would potentially unlock the 5 non-recognizers in EU, 4 in NATO, and make it possible for Kosovo to move on forward. What are we are facing now in Kosovo is uncertainty, because it is clear that the political representation of Serbs in Kosovo comes from Lista Srpska, which is very strongly linked to Vučić, and the Russian influence and the Serbian government influence in Kosovo remains still very high. As for China, Kosovo and China has never been an issue due to the lack of recognition, and lack of bilateral cooperation. But it was very important, and I think Vuk will come back at it later on. The fact that during the DC Accords, when signed, in the auspices of the Trump administration, it was China included in the agreement, and that was specifically for the case of Serbia and the 5G, and not related to Kosovo at all. So if you look at how the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, and how all the situations and issues in the Western Balkans that you mentioned, they are in a way all being handled by external actors, which, in addition to wanting to provide a solution for these issues in the Balkans, they do it having their interest as a priority, and that sometimes does not translate into success in the Balkans per se. So this is my first intervention. I'm open to questions and discussing more about this issue.
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot, Donika, for this view from Kosovo and on Kosovo, given the context of the Ukraine war. Now to Zagreb and to Croatia. Senada, I know that you have been following the situation in Bosnia quite closely, and you have been publishing, warning the West that it should do more, that there is an obvious threat, not only by Dodik, but also by pro-Russian forces in the Republic of Srpska, for the territorial integrity and stability in Bosnia. So it would be interesting to hear how much the situation has changed since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and what do you see unfolding in front of our eyes. And then obviously one or two sentences on Croatia. Croatia is member of the European Union, but we do know that there are close relations, or there have been close relations to Russia too. But also an openness to Chinese investments. So it would be good if you could just give us a kind of a very quick overview where Croatia stands now. I don't think that there is always this kind of an interesting question, what is going on in the head of the Croatian president? Doesn't we all the time ask ourselves, because he has been commenting a lot, but this is probably not the most interesting and primary question that I want to ask you. But if you could take this one on Bosnia and then shortly on Croatia, would be great. So Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Vedran. Pleasure to be with all of you. Many questions have been raised, so let me start with the one that you underlined, and that is situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which certainly Donika explained the situation in Kosovo. We can say for the whole of the Western Balkans that basically this unstable region, or region in dire need of security and stability, has been affected by the invasion of Ukraine for all kinds of reasons, the Russian presence, the sympathy and connections that exist with regime in Moscow from some countries in the region, the EU redirection of attention to Eastern Europe, and that mentioning only three elements. In the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, I think in the first couple of weeks of the war in Ukraine, we had a situation which could potentially explode, and this is the reference to the telephone conversation that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov had with Milorad Dodik, and there were lots of speculations what was the substance or the content of this conversation. However, the fact that the Russian invasion obviously is not going according to the plan or their plan has also slowed, I would say, the dynamic of security degradation, in particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But I would say that first, looking at the broader picture, I think we are far from over. I think we are just in the first, unfortunately, just at the beginning of a long conflict. And I don't think we will be able to say that it's over until it's fully over. You know, when they say for the enlargement, it's not over until all chapters are closed. So in this case, the war that started in Ukraine is
I think we lost Senada for a second. Senada, are you back? Do you hear us?
But I'm not optimistic about it having with teeth in its south. The reason I think
Senada,
is that,
sorry, we lost you for around 15-20 seconds. If you just could repeat your last argument, your picture was frozen.
Oh, sorry. My question, my comment, last one was an answer to what Mr. Petric asked, why the European Union, having this conflict looming from the East, should care about the Western Balkans. But I think we are really in a different situation now. And even discussion about enlargement is today is different than it was only a few months ago. And I think we all understand it, or at least should begin to understand it. The EU for itself has to answer whether it is an economic union or it is a geopolitical union. And if it was established because of peace or trade as means to enhance and sustain peace after the Second World War, and we don't have peace anymore, then we have a different situation. And I think the Western Balkans need to be treated with security lenses primarily in the current situation, because stability and the stability there is not taken for granted. It doesn't exist. We have no conflict. Vuk said that we may have small limited violence. I hope nothing of this happens, but just the fact that we still and keep open the possibility of a conflict or limited violence or whatever is the term is something that I think the EU should be worried, because it shouldn't allow Russia or any other actor for that matter to make use of the precarious security situation in the region. Speaking about Bosnia-Herzegovina, EUFOR recognized this, and on the 24th of February, on the very same day that Russia invaded Ukraine, EUFOR enhanced its troops by 500, and they strategically have located them in Bosnia-Herzegovina, probably on the basis of some intelligence, not just by incidents. I have to mention one thing which, and maybe simply invite you for comments. We speak a lot about Russia supporting Milorad Dodik in his active policy of undermining the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Dragan Čović, leader of HDZ in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is also supporting or partner to Dodik, and then in de facto of Russian politics there. And now with Russian invasion and then the operation or the war not going to at the dynamic that they expected, now they say everybody is going back to their normal politics, and Russia is no longer a strong player. But first, I'm not certain that this is the case. And second, it doesn't take a lot to Russia to undermine security. It's cheap to undermine stability in the Balkans. And in particular, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, you don't need, I mean, for Russia, it's important just that the assembly, the People's Assembly in Republika Srpska proclaim independence, just to have a paper, something to work with later on. It's slow process. It's not like somebody has a master plan and they know 5 or 10 or 15 steps in advance, and they will implement them in a planned order. No, I think there is this some sort of goal or intention, and that is a redefinition of the world order. This is what we are basically speaking about. It's not about Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not about the Balkans. It's not even about Ukraine. It's about the world order and where we stand in it. This is why China is also important in this context, because I agree with Thomas. China is standing at margins of the conflict now. I think it's looking at the West and Russia exhausting itself in this conflict. It logically, knowing what its intentions are, is thinking that it profits from the exhaustion of the two sides. But I think it will stand on the Russian side in supporting it, and therefore, again, I think the resources that we can see that Russia has at display may not be everything that we see. In this sense, and just one last point on China, I think China has long-term outlook, 2049, maybe a year that they look forward or play with, and the determination to simply confront the liberal world, I think is clear now to all of us. In that sense, Europe or the European Union, having limited defense capability, is now again in a position where the United States is the security provider in Europe. And this is the obvious situation that we need to count with. In that sense, I think the US presence in the Balkans would be also welcomed and necessary. I mean, we had this situation in the late 90s, and now we are again in the same situation. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Senada. I mean, when you mentioned the new global order and the fact that this is much bigger than the Western Balkans and then just a local conflict or a conflict in Ukraine, I was reminded of Michael Ignatieff's paper from the New York Review of Books written in 2014 called The New World Disorder, particularly also because I see Michael Ignatieff among the participants listening to us. And if I recall it correctly, the argument was basically that this kind of authoritarian capitalist type of regimes imprisoned in China and Russia has become basically liberal democracy's chief competitor. That was 2040 against the background of Crimea and MH17 that was downed over Ukraine. And Michael, if I'm not mistaken, was speaking about the authoritarian international and the question what the West and the liberal order can do in order to stop it. So this is this kind of a broader issue of the systemic competition. So Michael Ignatieff is now listening to us. Michael, if you would like to say a word, I can also give you a license to speak. You can just signal by waving the hand or putting it into the chat. If not, there is one question in the chat posed by Oana Kristea. And there is a question on the EU, and Wolfgang raised the question of the EU enlargement. Now, Senada made a point that we can't discuss the EU enlargement under the same circumstances like before the war in Ukraine. Here comes also a specific question on the current situation of the so-called EU strategic autonomy. Is there anyone who would like to say a word on this question of how the current situation is impacting the future of the EU strategic autonomy? And at the same time, as Michael put his answer here, thanks for the shootout. I mean, learning rather than speaking mode. Thanks, Michael, for that one. But if you have further thoughts now, having listened to interventions on this systemic competition and authoritarian international facing the liberal Leviathan, it's also highly welcome. Senada, is this your hand or your? So Wolfgang, do you want to say a word?
Well, of course, it's great to know that Michael is listening to what we are talking about. I think this is of crucial importance, what Michael wrote already some time ago about the authoritarian international. It's, of course, a sort of a contradiction in the diactor, but nevertheless, it is, of course, very important. And I think this goes to the core of EU enlargement or EU consolidation, as I like and prefer to talk when I talk about the Western Balkans. Which strand within the European Union are we actually strengthening when we take in the West Balkan 6? Is it the Hungarian version of Europe, or is it the original liberal democratic version? And this is, in my opinion, why France, to a large degree, I unfortunately am in support of the concerns in Paris and also in the Netherlands, that we need to be extremely careful when we talk about enlargement. And as you might recall, of course, I made this kind of proposal to do this in a staged way. What should be included in this staging is also that you could take this back. So it should be a two-way street in moving forward, and this continuously against the backdrop which strand will be is now being pursued by the potential members then in the end. I think this needs to be far more complex, much more sophisticated, and in a way much more policy-oriented and principle-oriented, which we need to do when it comes to the enlargement. But we need to do this because this is the most important, and in my opinion, almost the only way to effectively compete with China, which indeed will become much more important now in the Balkans than Russia will be. But let me now maybe go back to 2 points which I would like to respond to. Donika, rightly so, referred to the Munich speech. And I must say, a few years ago, I've written a book about the turning points in world politics. And there, the Munich speech has taken center stage. I'm also convinced that the Munich speech is very important. But what's different from the Crimea, while in Munich, Putin was talking about it, we were not listening. In Crimea, he was acting. And in between, clearly, Georgia is very important. But in Georgia, we must not forget that the then president provoked all of this, so that it's not that I want to put now of everything into the camp or the responsibility to Mr. Djugashvili, or what his name was, but still, here we can see the Georgia case is for me a prime example how much more sophisticated and sensitive and robust, of course, and forward-looking our European Union's foreign policy has to become. This is what is all about strategic autonomy. Now we're talking about the compass. We're talking about the Eastern neighborhood, which really needs to be revised, for example. So these are some of the points. And then I would like to also refer to Donika's US role. You might know and not know that since recently the United States has dispatched a real, how should I say, nuclear power diplomat and ambassador to Belgrade. This is Chris Hill. I think this is a strong signal from Washington that US wants to contribute to a solution when it comes to Kosovo, of course, but also in terms of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, one last point maybe to Senada. There might be a bit of a misunderstanding, but World War III is something that is being put forward. I'm just warning that if we agree with this, then of course a small region like the Western Balkans would not be included in the priority list. And this is what I would like to prevent. I think on the contrary, the European Union, now with the support of the United States, needs to really focus now and come up with more creative ideas when it comes to it. And then clearly, I mean, when we talk about Bosnia-Herzegovina in particular, the Dayton Accords has created the problem that that Bosnia-Herzegovina is divided in so many ways that it is kind of clear that Dodik and Jovic and Izetbegovic have taken advantage to capture, not to capture the state, but above all to solidify their power in the respective areas that they control. That is something which we need to much more focus on. And when we think of President Biden's democracy initiative, when we think that anti-corruption actually is so much part and parcel of it, then I think this is the way to go. But we need to remain vigilant when it comes to these issues there. And yes, again, an appeal on my part, and this is why I introduced some of the more provocative ideas into our discussion. We need to think out of the box, and we need to really take the situation in the Western Balkans when it comes to the external players very seriously. But I do believe, and I'm convinced that we, the Europeans, can succeed there. And in fact, when we talk about Serbia's or Serbs, whatever attachment to Russia, just ask the second question: where would you like to work, in Moscow or in Berlin? And then you know what the answer will be. So realities, if reality sets in, then Europe is the one and only option for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Speaking about thinking out of the box, I have to go back to other boxes on our Zoom screen. Donika raised her hand, and I also saw Senada's hand for quick responses on a few of the points raised by you and by other participants.
Thanks
Donika?
a lot, Vedran. I'll be very short on strategic autonomy and the way that the EU reacted. And I was looking at how the EU acted in the case of COVID. It took them 4 months to actually get their things together and react. But in terms of what happened in Ukraine, 1 weekend, 4 days was enough to mobilize, to change policies and be energized. So I'm thinking that, of course, I'm agreeing with Senada, the enlargement will look different. The future of Europe will look different. Now there is a conference of future of Europe, which Macron, it's ending, and Macron needs to have, to close it and to have at least some strategic vision of how the EU will look like in the future, and will definitely look different after what happened in Ukraine. Of course, our fear was that the political capital of the EU will not be invested in Western Balkans that much, but when you look at the enlargement, history, it was the Kosovo War that actually prompted the enlargement towards Central Eastern European countries. Every crisis, in a way, provoked the EU to expand and see and realize that enlargement is most likely the solution. So I'm hoping that the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, will change the perspective of how the EU looks at the Western Balkans and change its approach. State accession is okay, but I believe that merit-based accession, full accession, is very much needed, because political transformation of the region does not necessarily happen through funds or economy. It needs also the political aspect in it, and it's very much needed in order to complete the transition that we started in the early 2000s. Of course, we are hopeful that the US will be helping in this regard, having not just Chris Hill, but having Escobar and having this renewed US approach in the region, but also EU-US coordination and synergy in the region will probably result in something good. But my fear is that the US narrative so far has been like, oh, we are going after the EU because this is a European problem, like the Democrats do. And without the EU enlargement on the table, I am fearing that not a lot of things can be pushed in Western Balkans, unfortunately. So this is also like one of the most important messages that this panel discussion should send, is that, of course, democratization of the region is needed. It's an urgency. But also, when we talk about external influences in Germany, in Berlin, in Paris, in DC, as experts, we shouldn't be getting the response, are you blackmailing us? But we should really be having a response that we will look after it and we will take care of it and we will work together to respond to whatever is happening in the region thoroughly. And I think what is happening in Ukraine will definitely help change this approach that was so far, or response that so far we got, especially in Berlin.
Thank you so much, Danica. Senada, your take, and if you, this was a question to Vuk, there's a question by Paul Jankovic. First of all, how could stage accession happen? I mean, which we partly answered or touched upon at least. But the next one is quite interesting. Would some kind of a Western Balkans alliance, open Balkans, maybe a first step towards that kind of a stage accession, if you have a thought on that one. So another floor is, or Zoom is yours.
One quick answer to the strategic autonomy. I think, yes, indeed, defense is going to become a very strong element of our reality and investment. I mean, just think about 100 billion euros that Germany committed to spend in the next couple of years, and just how huge that investment is for European defense at large, and Germany in particular. But this will take time. I mean, even the purchase and the equipment and technology and devices and everything that goes with it, small and large, takes time to be produced. And it's we make now sudden decisions, but they somehow create trajectory in which way we will be going in the future. So I think defense as such and security provision are going to stay with us for the time to come in our near future. It's not going to disappear quickly. And I think we are still not mentally there. This is something that even when we discuss enlargement, as my answer to the second and third question, I think enlargement should never happen in peace, or certainly not in these conditions, without values. It makes no sense to think that the EU can be strengthened as a project by adding more countries that cannot function on the basis of the European rules. But having said that, the EU has to also acknowledge and face the fact that it has members who are acting against the European rules and norms. So before it can become an actor that is able to deal with its own deficiencies, I think it doesn't have the ability to not only enlarge, but to resolve issues in the Balkans, and not for the sake, again, I'm repeating this, not for the sake of the Balkans, but for the sake of the European Union. And if I can leave you with just one last comment regarding Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is really in a precarious situation. And I want to underline this. I think the main challenge for Bosnia-Herzegovina in the future will be how to deconstruct the Dayton Peace Agreement, but preserve Bosnia-Herzegovina within its current borders.
And that's probably the question for the next debate, focusing solely on Bosnia, because Bosnia, it is an interesting and a very important case. Vuk, your take, and one particular question, as we are speaking, Ursula von der Leyen announced that the Commission will trigger the budget conditionality to protect rule of law in the EU's case against Hungary. So, I mean, Senada was mentioning the values, and now after Viktor Orban won the elections in Hungary, it seems that the European Commission is ready to go for the next step. And my question will be also, do you see European Union going towards a tougher conditionality on Serbia now that Vučić has won?
That pretty much depends on the trade-offs that the European Union makes, and I think that it will not be just the issue of Russia. I mean, on that point, to be frank with you, I'm a bit skeptical about the appetite of the European Union to blackmail Hungary and cause a new rift in its own ranks when Europe is faced with such an unpredictable and dangerous international environment. But we will just have to wait and see. I mean, in terms of Vučić, I think that after these elections for the European Union, it is no longer just a problem whether Serbia is aligned with Russia or not. But I think that the European Union is also very much afraid of, okay, Vučić is out of the picture, on whom do we bet? I mean, at this moment in time, the liberal political parties, sadly, so because of their because of numerous reasons, because of the Vučić's campaign, aggressive campaign, because of the fact that many of them were already in power, so they cannot animate anti-Vučić voters. Many of them at this moment in time are a statistical error. So, and at the same time, we also have a whole set of minor right-wing parties who are not that big, but they are still Vučić's proxies, who also don't have encouraged the European Unions that they have anyone to talk to in Belgrade at this moment in time if it is not Vučić. So, I mean, the strategy might be, at least the way I look on it from the outside, might be something similar that the Biden administration did when it targeted several Vučić's associates with sanctions. They will still treat him as partner. They will still do business with him, but occasionally they will attack him on the flanks just so that sometimes they remind him of his own boundaries. I mean, that's my reading of the situation with these current trends, but who knows what can happen in days or weeks, months ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Vuk. And then last but not least, just a short question to Thomas. Thomas, I mean, we underlined that China has become a major investor and the partner for Serbia, etc., etc. But now, do you, now given the circumstances of the war in Ukraine, do you see any chance that China sometime soon is going to challenge the European Union, the West, politically in the Western Balkans? Is it going to step up its presence to be this kind of authoritarian capitalist role model that wants offensively to confront the West in the Western Balkans? Is this an option?
Thanks. So what I think is China is going to stick with two-pronged strategy, economic influence, and also gaining more narrative influence. I think it's very interesting if you look at recent opinion polling from the Western Balkans, that respondents in many countries actually think that China helped them more during the pandemic than the European Union did. That you see people actually trusting Chinese vaccines more than Western vaccines, or at least trust them as much. And you see in almost all countries actually people responding that the West is more to blame for the current standoff between the West and China than China is. So this is the two-pronged strategy that I would see. As for more offensive political competition or even going into the security sphere, I think that China will still let Russia take the lead or perhaps let Serbia take the lead, and will only be a diplomatic cover and financial support for autocratization in the region.
Okay, thank you so much. Senada also mentioned the year 2049 for China. I mean, I just can hope that we don't need to wait until 2049 until the European Union, the West, steps up its presence in the Western Balkans and finally finishes this kind of a European peace project by encompassing the Western Balkans and making it part of the European Union. Thank you so much, all of you, for today's discussion. We obviously put too much on the table at the beginning. We managed to eat a little bit. Let's see how it is going to develop over the course of the evening hours. Still a lot of food on the table, but to all the participants, thank you for your participation. To all of those visiting us via Zoom and listening to us, thanks a lot. Please keep following Senada's, Donika's, Vuk's, Thomas, and Wolfgang's publication on these issues on the systemic competition. Thomas and I will publish a working paper on the Chinese influence in the Western Balkans in the next few days, unfortunately in German, but there will be some English translations too. In any case, enjoy your evening, stay healthy, wish you all the best, and thanks again for participating today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Danke, Vedran.
Papa,
Danke,
Thomas. Danke dir, Wolfgang.
Vielen Dank, Vedran.
Danke, alles Liebe, Papa. Waren interessante Punkte.
Ich schicke dann noch das Papier über die externen Akteure am Balkan von der Nationalbank.
Super, das wäre gut, weil dann kann man das ja noch
ist
inkludieren.
2018, aber die ist natürlich dieselbe
Super.
Argumentation drinnen, die ihr auch habt. So.
Ja, das inkludieren wir dann hinein. Danke dir, Wolfgang, nochmal. Alles Liebe.
Also,
Papa. Ciao.